Excellent. Okay, bottom of page 90. Finally, there's a philosophical line of evidence for the beginning of the universe. This line of evidence is so rationally inescapable that some consider it the strongest argument of all. It's called the kalam, from the Arabic word meaning eternal. So it's the eternal cosmological argument, the kalam cosmological argument. Now listen, kalam cosmological argument sounds a whole lot like cosmological argument, right? They're two separate things. The cosmological argument is what we've been talking about in this whole chapter. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. That is the cosmological argument for the beginning of the universe. This is the philosophical argument for the beginning of the universe, and it's called the kalam. It's called cosmological argument because it's an argument for the beginning of the universe, but it's a separate one. It's a philosophical one. So make sure you know that those two things are different. Every year I get kids switch those around. So here's what the kalam says. An infinite number of days has no end, but today is the end day of history, history being a collection of all days. Therefore, there were not an infinite number of days before today. In other words, time had a beginning. To grasp this argument, see the timeline below, marked in segments of days. The further left you go, the further back in history you go. Now assume for a moment that this line extends to the left indefinitely, so that you can't see if or where it begins. But as you look to the right, you can see the end of the line because the last segment of the line represents today. Tomorrow isn't here yet. So today is the end of history for now, right? Because is tomorrow history? No, it's in the future. So the days going to the right, the days coming, have not come yet. So there's not an infinite number of days going this direction. There are no days going this direction. Tomorrow isn't here yet, but when it gets here, we'll add one more segment, day, to the right end of the line. Now here's how this proves that time had a beginning. Since the line certainly ends on the right, the timeline cannot be infinite because something that is infinite has no end. And today, right now, is the end of history, right? As we know it. Now, again, tomorrow it'll be tomorrow, but for right now, this moment is the only thing that's part of history. And everything. So, moreover, you can't add anything to something that is infinite. That makes sense, right? You can handle that, right? If it's infinite, there's nothing more than that. You can't get any more than infinite. But tomorrow, we will add another day to our timeline. So time must not be infinite because you can't add anything to anything that is infinite. So our timeline is undeniably finite, not infinite. The opposite of infinite is finite, meaning that it has parameters. Let's consider this argument from a different angle. If there were an infinite number of days before today, then today would never have arrived. But here we are. So that there must have been only a finite number of days before today. In other words, even though we may not be able to see, as we look to the left, where the line begins, we know it had to begin at some point because only a finite amount of time could be passed for today to arrive. You understand this? That you can't add anything to infinite. Each day we add another day. There can't be an infinite number of days before today because we keep adding to time. And you literally can't add on anything to infinity. In other words, even though we may not be able to see as we look to the left where the line begins, we know it had to begin at some point because only a finite amount of time could be passed for today to arrive. You can't traverse an infinite number of days. Thus, time must have had a beginning. Some may say that infinite numbers can exist, so why can't infinite days? So in math, you've probably talked about a number line has an infinite number, has an infinite possibility of numbers, right? So if that's true, why can't then there be an infinite number of days? Because there's a difference between an abstract infinite series and a concrete one. The one is purely theoretical, the other is actual. Mathematically, we can conceive of an infinite number of days, but actually, we could never count or live in an infinite number of days. You can conceive of an infinite number of mathematical points between two bookends, but on a shelf, but you could not fit an infinite number of books between them. You can conceive of an infinite number of apples, but can you actually have an infinite number of apples? You can't. There are only so many apples in the world, right? The number of apples in the world is finite. But we can conceive of that in our brain, just as we can in mathematical points. Make it reality. That's the difference between an abstract and a concrete. Numbers are abstract. Days are concrete. By the way, this amplifies our answer above as to why there could not have been an infinite number of bangs in the cosmological history of the universe. An infinite number of actual events is impossible. What we are saying here is that the universe, the Big Bang or not, had a beginning. That is, the cosmological argument is true because both premises of the argument are true. Everything that comes to be has a cause, and the universe came to be. Since the universe had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. So here's what you need to know about the Kalam. You need to know the actual argument, which is stated on pages 90 and 91. An infinite number of days has no end, but today is the end day of history, history being a collection of days. Therefore, there were not an infinite number of days before today, as in time had a beginning. And then you need to do your best to explain it. I am not expecting you to explain it like a philosopher would. I'm just asking you to explain it based on what is said in this book, to know what is said about it in this book. That's all I'm holding you accountable. So, next thing, who made God? In light of all the evidence for the beginning of the space-time universe, the beginner must be outside the space-time universe. Why? Why does the thing that began the universe have to be outside of it? Well, that's true. That's true. But time and space came into being with the universe. There was no time or space. So God has to be, or the beginner, whoever the beginner is, has to be outside of that. Because there was no time or space. Does that make sense? So, and I like the way you put it, though. That's a good way to put it. So, when God is suggested as the beginner, atheists are quick to ask the age-old question, then who made God? If everything needs a cause, then God needs a cause too. As we have seen, the law of causality is the very foundation of science. Science is a search for causes, and that search is based on our consistent observation that everything that has a beginning has a cause. In fact, the question, who made God, points out how seriously we take the law of causality. It's taken for granted that virtually everything needs a cause. So why then doesn't God need a cause? Because the atheist contention misunderstands the law of causality. The law of causality does not say that everything needs a cause. It says that everything that comes to be needs a cause. Everything that has had a beginning needs a cause. God did not come to be. No one made God. He is unmade. As an eternal being, God did not have a beginning, so he didn't need a cause. But wait, the atheist will protest. If you can have an eternal God, then I can have an eternal universe. After all, if the universe is eternal, then it did not have a cause. Yes, it is logically possible that the universe is eternal and therefore didn't have a cause. In fact, It is one of the only two possibilities. Either the universe or something outside the universe is eternal. Since something undeniably exists today, then something must have always existed. We have only two choices, the universe or something that caused the universe. The problem for the atheist is that while it is logically possible that the universe is eternal, it does not seem to be actually possible. For all the scientific and philosophical evidence, surge, radioactive decay, and the cosmological argument tells us that the universe cannot be eternal. So by ruling out one of the two options, we are left with the only other option. Something outside the universe is eternal. When you get right down to it, there are only two possibilities for anything that exists. Either one, it has always existed and is therefore uncaused, or two, it had a beginning and was caused by something else. It can't be self-caused because it would have had to exist already in order to cause anything. According to the overwhelming evidence, the universe had a beginning, so it must be caused by something else, by something outside itself. Notice that this conclusion is consistent with theistic religions. Theistic religions are Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. They all believe in a single personal God. So when it says theistic religions, it's saying Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Now, we're going to end the semester with there is a theistic God who created the universe. Second semester, we're going to look at, okay, which theistic God is it? Okay, so that's the rest of our semester is figuring out who this first cause is. So notice that this conclusion is consistent with theistic religions, but it's not based on those religions. It is based on good reason and evidence. So what is this first cause like? One might think you need to rely on a Bible or some other so-called religious revelation to answer that question. But again, we don't need anyone's scripture to figure that out. Einstein was right when he said science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. Religion can be informed and confirmed by science, as it is by the cosmological argument. Namely, we can discover some characteristics of the first cause just from the evidence we've discussed in this chapter. From that evidence alone, we know the first cause must be self-existent. He doesn't need anything else to exist. He is timeless. He is infinite. He is non-spatial, meaning he's non-physical. He's not physical. And immaterial. Since the first cause created time, space, and matter, the first cause must be outside of time, space, and matter. In other words, he is without limits or infinite. He is unimaginably powerful in order to create the entire universe out of nothing. He is supremely intelligent because he designed the universe first with such incredible precision. We'll talk about more of that in the next chapter. And he's personal. In order to choose to convert a state of nothingness into the time-space material universe, he'd have to be personal. An impersonal force has no ability to make choices. These characteristics of the first cause are exactly the characteristics that theists ascribe to God. Again, these characteristics are not based on someone's religion or subjective experience. They are drawn from the scientific evidence we have just reviewed, and they help us see a critically important section of the box top to this puzzle we call life. Conclusion. If there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing? Years ago, I, Norm, debated an atheist at the University of Miami on the question, does God exist? After I presented much of the evidence we have reviewed here, I had the opportunity to ask my opponent some questions. Here's what I asked him. Sir, I have some questions for you. First, if there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing at all? I then proceeded to ask a few more questions, thinking he would answer them in sequence. Now, usually when you debate someone, you're trying to persuade the audience. You don't expect to get your opponent to admit he's wrong. He's got too much invested in his position, and most debaters have too much ego to admit an error. This guy was different. He surprised me when he said, regarding the first question, that's a good question. That's a really good question. And without any other comment, he went on to answer my second question. Never answered that. After hearing the evidence for the existence of God, this debater was left questioning his own beliefs. He even attended a follow-up meeting and expressed that he had doubts about atheism. His faith in atheism was waning, was decreasing, indeed. If there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing, is the question we all have to answer. And in light of the evidence, we are left with only two options. Either no one created something out of nothing, or else someone created something out of nothing. Which view is more reasonable? Nothing created something? No. Even Julie Andrews knew the answer when she sang in Sound of Music. Nothing comes from nothing. Nothing ever could. And if you can't believe that nothing caused something, then you don't have enough faith to be an atheist. The most reasonable view is God. Robert Jastrow suggested this when he ended his book, God and the Astronomers, with this classic line. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story of the beginning of the universe ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak, and as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. In other words, the Bible is not right. So let's turn in. You can keep your book open especially to the Causality. But let's turn to page 27 in your Little Atheist book. Did we finish through question 11? We got through question 11? Okay, but we didn't talk about 12, right? Okay. So what is the Kalam argument and why is it important? Let's start with this. Give me the definition, not the premises and the conclusion. Give me the definition, like what is the Kalam? Go. Yes. So it's a philosophical argument for the beginning of the universe. Now, what does it say? What's the first premise? Yeah.
An infinite number of days has no end.
An infinite number of days has no end. Is that true? Anything that's infinite has no end, right? That's the definition of infinite. Infinite is limitless, right? So that is true. An infinite number of days has no end. What's the second one? Yes. Who's it? Right. Today is the end day of history. Is that true? Yeah, it is, because tomorrow is the future. It's not history. Now, I don't mean the end of history like the world is ending. It's just the end of the timeline for history for today. Does that make sense? Okay. Then what's the conclusion? Yes.
Therefore, we're not an infinite number of days.
Yeah, there can't be. So therefore, we're not an infinite number of days before today. If we had to, right, we could count back the days that we've had already, right? It would take a long time. Probably all of us would be dead by the time it's all happened. But we could count how many days there have been, theoretically. But we have to stop it today, because we can't the days that are coming have not come yet. There can't be an infinite number of days, because it would have to go infinitely inwards. Let me see if this helps. There's no time in heaven. That's why we will live eternally, because time stops. There's no time. We're not bound by time. On the earth, we're bound by time. And time is finite. Time is not eternal. Time on earth is not eternal. It's finite. Does that help a little bit? I've been trying for like 7 years to figure out the way to explain this so that people's brains don't start, having that blaring, man, there's a problem here about this argument. So here's what you need to know. It says, why is it important? Or here's another thing you need to know. The Kalam cosmological argument is proof outside of science that supports the science. It is not a scientific argument. It is a philosophical argument that supports the science that we've already studied. It also supports the Bible. And the science supports the Bible. Do you have any questions on any of that? So I think what I told you is that I expect you to know the literal argument. I expect you to know the definition, that is the philosophical argument for the beginning of the universe. I expect you to be able to write out the Kalam. An infinite number of days has no end. Today is the end of history, therefore there couldn't have been an infinite number of days before now. And then I'm also going to ask you to explain it. I am not going to ask you to explain it completely. I can't explain it. To the best of your ability, explain what it means. Okay? And that test is on Wednesday. We are going to, tomorrow, we're going to wait on those engaged questions for tomorrow. You have the rest of today to study for your test. In my experience, this test is challenging. So make sure that you're working on study that.